We've all noticed that movies are all the same these days, and although the creative bankruptcy of Hollywood is definitely a factor, the same thing is true for Japanese anime, Korean webtoons, and even those strange yet fascinating Reddit stories or indie books on Amazon. And I would know because me and my friend Gabi launched a webtoon series that explores precisely this topic. You guys should click the link in the description and read it for free, if you're interested. It's called Fractal Fables, about a teenage girl who realizes that her fictional characters are real in the multiverse. Think of it as Gate meets Sophie's World meets that South Park Imagination Land episode, but it's meant to explore the fractal nature of stories that have infinitely repeating archetypes and story beats across the major genres. No matter where you look, storytelling seems to be dictated by all the same tropes and narrative structure. You guys know what I'm talking about. There's a protagonist with something special about him. The hero is typically born to or of some special status, a special destiny, and or special lineage, even if he doesn't know it yet. Or he just has a special virtue, ability, gift, or event that makes him special. There's the call to adventure, a quest mission of some sort. There's typically some MacGuffin that he has to find. Perhaps a leading lady in his life that he woos. Or not. Sometimes she's unobtainable or ends up with someone else, but she's still there as a force in the story. There's also a main antagonist, of course. And perhaps a mentor who guides the hero. Maybe a monster or two. Mysterious, otherworldly forces. And for some reason he has to master the sword and medieval-style combat arts even if he's riding freaking rocket ships. But most importantly, it's a story about heroism, with allusions to resurrection, the dark night of the soul, and the meaning of life and death, but especially a cause worth fighting for. These tropes are so ubiquitous that we don't notice it anymore, and it just feels like necessary story elements. But are they? Just think back on all the boring stuff you had to read for high school, like Death of a Salesman. Who's the hero in that story? And why doesn't somebody slice up Bith with a sword? Then maybe it'd be more interesting. A lot of this has to do with James Campbell's hero's journey, as I'm sure some of you noticed. But I think there's more to it, as I'll get into in a bit. But the main epic genres, as I like to call them, that dominate our global collective imagination, are actually the same thing with only superficial aesthetic differences. Talking about the genres of fantasy, superheroes, and space opera. But in the past, they had another name, pulp fiction.
My name is the Lord!
But the pulp stories of the 30s were chaotic and sported many different philosophical ideas, from the nihilism of Lovecraft's cosmic horror to the passionate detective stories for naughty boys. But it was pulp stories like Flash Gordon and John Carter of Mars that gave shape to the space opera we know and love today, with princesses and knight-errants in space, and it was the gentleman warrior of Zorro, who dressed in a mask to fight injustice, that gave rise to the superhero genre. However, American pulp was decidedly less influential for the fantasy genre because the brutal, more pagan attitude of might makes right in the sword and sorcery stories of Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian gave way to the more Christian medieval outlook of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Ironically, Robert E. Howard's character of Solomon Kane, as the knight-errant archetype traveling around hunting monsters, witches, and evildoers, was a lot more influential in spawning imitations in his respective genre of paranormal hunter than Conan was in the fantasy genre, despite being less famous as a character. Precisely because it was the pulp stories that drew from a more medieval outlook that had a more lasting legacy, whose influence is more clearly felt in our era. You can probably guess from the title or thumbnail of the video where I'm going with this. These stories are just the current version of the tales of chivalry, also known as the chivalric romance. Though romance meant something different when it was first coined as a term. It referred to adventure, but not the sexual kind, because we're pious Christians in this genre. But romance in the modern sense of two people getting clingy with each other was still a major part of these original tales of chivalry, which is why the meaning of romance eventually changed. Though women's fantasy books in this day and age still keep the legacy of courtly dalliance, scandalous love affairs, and unhealthy obsessive stalking of the old chivalric stories alive and well. Like the paranormal romance in Twilight, which is the chivalric story from the perspective of the damsel in distress. Edward Cullen is literally a knight in shiny vampire skin. You also have those really weird Asian, I reincarnated as a villainess stories in anime and webtoons about a chick getting freaky with a psycho K-pop versions of Joffrey Baratheon or something. I don't know, I don't read that particular genre, but it has the medieval and chivalric trappings of courtly love. Courtly love. My point is, My point is, the three main genres that dominate the entertainment industry are actually just one genre with the same archetypes, tropes, and story structure. You see this more explicitly in the superhero genre, where just beyond the normal world with its mighty spandex soldiers of justice, you have mythical kingdoms of sword and sorcery like Ithaca, Atlantis in the DC universe, but also Asgard in Marvel, right alongside galactic guardians and green space cops that have adventures across many planets. But we also see this with how fantasy and space opera have basically the same storylines of knights, princesses, and witches and wizards. Even when they try to lean more into the science part of science fiction, like Star Trek, Mass Effect, Halo, or Asimov's Foundation series, there is usually some sort of space aristocracy and feudal houses, even if it's just the aliens who are still medieval and not enlightened humans with space democracy, like with the Klingons and the Sangheli in Halo. Not to mention that these stories without exception have space magic, pretending to be science. These stories also have knightly tech armor or force shields as a big part of the setting, making the hero protagonist usually a knight in armor archetype. And Captain Kirk can pretend to be a sophisticated and enlightened modern man all he wants, but deep down, he's just another knight-errant wandering around from planet to planet, saving innocents and getting into really dumb fistfights with rubber-suited dragons. Also, superheroes themselves are really just manly knights and beautiful warrior shield maidens that populate the chivalric romances of the Renaissance era. In many cases, they're literally knights or the closest modern equivalent to it, like Batman, who's not only called the Dark Knight, caped crusader and such, and is not only a warrior but privileged upper-class billionaire who lives in a manor, and not only has young squires that serve him in his knightly duties, but Bruce Wayne is an actual descendant of Scottish nobility, at least from some of the stories I've read. But besides the obvious, all the heroes are just as conspicuous in their chivalric origins. Superman comes from the literal noble house of El. Aquaman is a literal prince. In DC Comics in general, the heroes don't really hide it, as they form their literal family groupings, with their own symbols of heraldry. You have the Bat family, the Super family, the Arrow family, the Aqua family, the Flash family. But it's no different in Marvel. Iron Man is another billionaire in literal armor, and Danny Rand is a billionaire who is trained in mystical fighting arts. Billionaires in general are just a shorthand for modern nobility in these stories. It's why comics read like a flamboyant Forbes list of vigilantes with daddy issues. Jokes aside, Marvel might have more variety in their heroes, but in reality they're just more subtle. Heroes like the Spider-Men seem like they're breaking the mold, but Peter Parker has the mysterious parentage trope common in chivalric romances, where his daddy was a badass, and Miles Morales has his father be a cop. Cops also draw from the chivalric imagery, being guardians of their local community and wearing badges, which are filled with medieval motifs. The capes many superheroes wear are also very medieval. It's what the nobles often wear, and they even had combat techniques involving them. It's where the term cloak and dagger comes from, so they weren't entirely useless. Keep that in mind whenever a Pixar fashionista comes to mind.
No kicks!
I can't stress enough how the superhero tropes are generally just modern iterations of the chivalric stories of the late Middle Ages and Renaissance. From having child and teenage psychics, which are just page boys and squires for the superhero knight, but also, having special powers, weapons, or armor that single them out for a very specific heroic destiny. I'm sure none of this will come as a surprise to most of you listening. Even if you didn't think much about this before, I'm sure it makes sense to you now that it's pointed out. But I just find it odd that in the usual commentary about fantasy and superheroes specifically, people normally call it the new myths and draw parallels to the pagan stories of the Greeks and Vikings. And sure, yeah, there's definitely that element. They are in fact clear inspirations, but they're definitely not the main influence. James Campbell's idea of the monomyth for the hero of 1,000 faces is a bit of a misnomer. Not all myths are hero stories, like the story of that moron who falls in love with his own reflection and then drowns himself. Or that other one about a dude sticking his own mother. Maybe the story of a guy flying too close to the sun and falling to his death. Also, the Iliad is more of a war drama with magic more than anything else. The reason why most people, even the writers of these stories themselves, assume that Greek mythology is the main inspiration is for two reasons. One, the chivalric romances themselves are inspired by Greek and Norse myths as well. And two, the chivalric romances have been thoroughly replaced by what we have now. The formula as we know it may have its origins on some relatively few Greek myths, like Theseus and the Minotaur, Jason and the Argonauts, and of course Hercules. though Perseus killing Medusa is I think the most important influence to this whole thing, since he was one of the few heroes with a happy ending, and he saved Andromeda as the damsel in distress from the monster of the Kraken. This story may well be the origin of the trope of the princess held captive by the dragon, so tightly associated with medieval legends. Though with Peach and Bowser now, this trope sure came a long way. But it was also very prominent in superhero films up until a decade ago when Hollywood got allergic to it. But despite the clear influence, the classical tragic pagan hero and the chivalric hero of Christendom aren't exactly the same. The concept of the well-intentioned hero like Batman, Superman, Captain America, Aragorn, and Captain Kirk, who dedicate themselves to protect the innocent, gained their identity in the Middle Ages. The traditional hero of today is a combination of classical pagan and biblical heroes. Strong, mighty men of action in service to an ideal greater than themselves. That's what happens when you merge the two together. We see this with the 9 worthies in the Middle Ages. These were 3 heroes taken from the classical period, the Bible, and the Middle Ages that had been selected by medieval scholars as the best example of chivalry from age to age. You'll notice that medieval scholars admired Hector, the Trojan hero, as one of the 9 worthies, and not his Greek counterpart Achilles. Why? Because Hector was actually a noble, self-sacrificing hero, while Achilles was just a total asshole. But Achilles is the glorified victor in the Iliad because personal virtue was less important than brute and glorious strength for the classical authors. It doesn't matter that you are the noble prince just trying to defend your people and family if you don't have the strength to back it up. At least from the pagan perspective. You'd just be crushed and have your corpse humiliated and your family and people slaughtered by the protagonists who are defined by their strength, not their moral virtues. The pagans focused more on the ability to overcome great physical odds, destroying your enemies and accomplishing great deeds, while the chivalric hero is about overcoming his personal flaws, and through his virtues he accomplishes great deeds. Because his strength is the result of his morality. His quest is about personal improvement just as much as it is about physically fighting the bad guy. It's why he usually gets more of a happy ending, while the tragic Greek hero often gets crushed by his personal flaws. And also because in the Christian ideal, virtue is eventually rewarded by the creator of the universe, while for the pagans, the gods are just as petty and terrible as the mortals. But for the Christian medieval hero, being crushed by the tough thug and being humiliated didn't matter. What mattered was overcoming your sins to do the right thing, and the right thing would eventually overcome evil. We clearly see that most of our modern protagonists exhibit chivalric Christian traits more than the pagan ones. Usually. That has been changing a little bit in the last several decades, but still most of our stories are about personal growth, and only by doing that do they get their happy ending. Which is why we ironically get sanitized Greek myths like Percy Jackson or pagan characters like Thor and Hercules, who are given the chivalric treatment in their Disney movies, where their stories are painfully and clearly informed by medieval Christian elements. Heck, they even give Thor, the Norse god, a sword in the stone moment from the King Arthur stories, who is one of the Christian heroes in the 9 worthies, and whose story was inspired by the life of Catholic Saint Galgano. The sword in the stone is actually a real holy relic that you can visit in Italy. Now you might have the false impression that the chivalric hero is exclusively male, so the addition of female heroic warriors, so ubiquitous these days, is a break from the chivalric romance, where women are exclusively fainting damsels who need to be rescued from the dragon, and therefore our modern stories are more inspired by the Greek Amazon or Atalanta myth with strong warrior females. But that's wrong. There's plenty of female knights and warrior women in chivalric romances. You have Bradamante, Marfisa, Clorinda, Gildepep, Britomart, Radegund, and others. In my video praising Éowyn from The Lord of the Rings, some of my viewers complained about her being proto-woke modern cringe and Tolkien's only mistake because true tradition keeps women only in the kitchen, but that's far from the truth since the female knight is a well-established archetype in medieval and Renaissance literature. But I'll get to that later. The chivalric romance never dies and has always been immensely popular. We unfairly neglect the influence of 1,000 years of Western culture and the development of the modern novel by underestimating just how influential the chivalric romances were and are, and we only disregard them for ideological reasons. Because modern man wanted to pretend that he was more independent from the past than he actually was. The phenomenon of popular hero stories spawning a bajillion sequels and remakes isn't exclusive to our times, but happened a lot in the 1500s, especially in Spain where the chivalric romance in its traditional form reached its apex. We might think that superhero or fantasy stories are extremely formulaic right now, and we might hope that these stories will get more creative in the future, after they finally run their course, but this formula has literally been around for centuries, and we still can't get enough of it. When you read the Spanish and Italian chivalric romances in particular, we see just how little things have changed. The modern fantasy genre in particular is basically the same thing, filled with far-off mythical kingdoms, magic and giants and dragons. Yeah, sure, some tropes go away to be replaced by others, of course. Many of those old knight protagonists in those stories would go insane or become isolated hermits after losing their love interest. That's more rare now, with a few exceptions. But it's amazing how this seems to be the story that human beings like the most, though the strength of its presence might oscillate over the eras. But if you're getting sick of these hero stories and think they're stupid and wish they would just die already, you're not alone. In the times of Shakespeare, people were getting sick of it too. It's part of the reason why his tragic stories that borrowed heavily from Greco-Roman narrative traditions of flawed heroes doing messed up crap was so successful and refreshing at the time. But Shakespeare has nothing on his Spanish contemporary, who lived and died around the same time as the renowned English playwright. If there is any man who came close to finally killing the chivalric romance, it was definitely Miguel Cervantes, when he wrote Don Quixote, the first modern novel and the best-selling one of all time. Like many these days, his goal was to subvert, deconstruct, and ridicule the chivalric hero story. It's funny that these days, it's to the point where fantasy superhero deconstructions are more annoying and less original than just playing it straight, but Cervantes actually laid the groundwork for this. However, this guy, Miguel Cervantes himself, was very different from the typical subversive writer types. You know, your Alan Moores, Eric Kripke's, George R. R. Martin's, Mark Miller's, Neil Gaiman's, Ryan Johnson types. Most of these guys are either edgy boys for cheap shock value, even if they might not be ill-intentioned, or they're prissy intellectual types using their storytelling and trained eloquence to promote a cynical or degenerate worldview. Some of these, like Alan Moore, are just morally twisted guys who feel personally threatened by hero stories and even call it the F word. Oh no, it's the ghost of fascism! This doesn't apply to everyone I mentioned on that list of creators, but some are in fact just trying to promote moral relativism in an attempt to tear down the idea of heroism to promote their own personal mediocrity as human beings, or barely concealed fetishes, with their characters monologuing about how it's okay to consume corn about family incest involving children. But Miguel Cervantes wasn't at all like this. In fact, the reason why he wanted to subvert and viciously attack the chivalric narrative in his story about a delusional guy trying to live out a fantasy was because, in a way, that was his own life story. But unlike his Don Quixote, Cervantes actually lived the chivalric story. He just ended up hating it. You see, when he was a child, his mother used to read him the popular chivalric romances of his day, saying they influenced him would be a severe understatement. When he became a teenager, the dude got involved in a duel, a real fight with weapons, which was illegal in Spain, so he had to run from the law to Italy, where he joined the papal army and ended up fighting in the Battle of Lepanto to save Christendom from the domineering Ottoman Empire. He got wounded and lost the use of his left arm, but received medals for his courage, but he didn't call it quits. He still served in the army, fighting in cavalry charges as a one-armed badass, and received even more medals. But things took a dark turn when he got captured by the Ottomans. There he saw his friends brutally impaled in that horrific execution technique that the Ottomans liked doing, but became famous with a certain vampiric Transylvanian count. Cervantes was spared to be taken for ransom because he was taken for a minor noble, so the poor guy spent years in prison. But at first, his spirit wasn't broken, as he tried escaping 4 times. One time he made it 400 kilometers but was captured. Another time he managed to hide in a cave for a few months but was captured again. After a few years, he just spiraled down into a living nightmare, breaking down into tearful despair. In the end, his freedom came when his ransom was finally paid. Some say his relatives managed to finally gather up enough family money. Others say a Catholic charity of religious monks specializing in freeing Christian captives paid for his release. I believe that it was probably a combination of both. But what matters is that at the end of his adventures and medals, he ended up disabled, severely traumatized, and broke. He had to get by doing odd jobs and eventually went to prison again in Spain for tax evasion, though for a shorter, more humane sentence this time. It was at his moment in his life that he began to write, and you can understand his cynicism. Again, Cervantes wasn't the artsy degenerate and subversive author of today, but an abandoned war veteran left to rot by the civilization he risked everything to defend. You can understand why he had a bone to pick with the literary genre that inspired him to live such a hard life. But when he published Don Quixote, his fortunes changed, since it was an immediate success for several reasons. The main one being that it was this era where you had a rising middle class of merchants and bureaucratic professionals, and they loved a book mocking the values of the ruling warrior class of the time. But ironically, the success of his subversion made Cervantes reflect on the value of the chivalric story. It also forced him to write a sequel for Don Quixote a year before his death. Part 2 was a meta-narrative analyzing his own subversion of the chivalric stories, but also the idea of life being about us playing out a narrative in our heads. But despite all this, at the very end of his life, Miguel Cervantes was suddenly filled with an urge to write one final book. It was to be his most important book, what he believed to be his magnum opus. He called it Los Trabajos de Persiles y Sigismunda. It was a traditional chivalric romantic epic with fantastic elements, instead of the cynical realism that had made him famous. A story of adventure, romance, and heroism that he managed to complete just 3 days before he died. But the world ignored it, because the world was changing. Don Quixote became the most best-selling novel of all time. It was declared to be the first modern novel, and it was so beloved because in the 1500s, the modern era that we know now was just starting to begin. Such a world cared nothing for a traditional chivalric story from an old warrior coming to terms and accepting the genre that inspired his own life. By learning his biography, we can understand why he wrote a book about a delusional minor noble who was enamored by chivalric romances, only to get in trouble with duels and misadventures that gets himself hurt. But Cervantes' final book symbolizes that the Spanish veteran found meaning in his pain during his old age. He also became more religious by getting involved with the Franciscan religious order and wanting to be buried near the Trinitarian religious order that helped free him in his younger days. But it's important to note that in many ways, his life was in fact a chivalric epic, even if not particularly romantic. What's romantic about the chivalric epic is not that the hero lives a fun adventure, perpetually kicking some tushy with boring overpowered ease. The true chivalric story was never baseless wish fulfillment. These characters, from King Arthur, Orlando, Amadee of Gaul, to Frodo, Luke Skywalker, Batman, Iron Man, Spider-Man, etc., are all characters who suffer and sacrifice tremendously. Their lives are essentially defined by pain. What's truly romantic about the chivalric story is the idea that the protagonist becomes strong enough to endure with dignity his horrific experiences, which is incredibly hard to do in real life, of course. And it's not something to take lightly. The cynical attitude that many have with these hero stories is that they downplay just how horrific the effects of PTSD are, or that they romanticize suffering and living short, lonely lives in constant struggle, or that they glorify war, which is a danger in the hands of inexperienced authors, to be fair, but not worth disregarding entire genres over. Miguel Cervantes had a crisis of faith in chivalry once he realized how difficult it really was. Once he got the chivalric life, he understandably hated it for a while, just like many of the characters in the chivalric hero stories themselves also do, ironically enough. Character arcs where protagonists begin to shirk their responsibility, like Orlando in Renaissance literature, or Spider-Man more recently, are pretty common. Perhaps writing Don Quixote was just part of the Dark Night of the Soul plot arc of Cervantes' own hero's journey life arc story. The heroes in the chivalric romances suffer all the time. They're wounded, go insane, become isolated and alone, and in many stories, they do in fact die tragically. But the meaning behind it lies in the relentless pursuit of overcoming the odds and doing the right thing. It's why chivalry never dies. It's about not having a cynical outlook on virtue, sacrifice, suffering, and human potential. Proof that the chivalric story never died is that some subversive storylines keep coming back as well. Mark Millar's Kick-Ass comic is literally just an edgier version of Don Quixote, but for superheroes. I have no problem with Mark Millar like I do with someone like Alan Moore. I just think Millar is an edgy boy. But his Millar World universe has a rewarding underlying plot arc to it about rediscovering hero stories that I admire. But yeah, Kick-Ass is about a silly adolescent named Dave Liszewski who tries becoming a superhero after reading too many comics, which gets him in trouble with the mafia and have misadventures with his mean girl high school crush, like Don Quixote. The problem arises by Dave Liszewski being enamored with the superficial aspect of the chivalric story, or superhero story in this case, the shiny armor / colorful costume, having a companion and love interest, and going on a larger-than-life adventure, instead of focusing on the grim reality of waging actual real war against injustice, with all the real risks and sacrifices that entails. It's definitely possible to live a heroic life story. People who succeed are often the type to have their faces carved into mountains, but the reality of trying to live the heroic story is that it makes pain and suffering for a greater cause your way of life. That's what it's really about. Teddy Roosevelt doesn't shy away from that in his inspirational quotes. Of course, the characters from the stories by Cervantes and Mark Miller fetishize the suffering and sacrifice as a mere cool aesthetic that makes the chivalric hero look so awesome, but they don't understand that the painful sacrifice is the point of the chivalric story and not a decorative side thing. Batman, grieving over the loss of his parents, is a constant reminder of the evil he's dedicated himself to fight so that others don't have to suffer what he has suffered. It's not mere justification to make him brood in the dark and look all cool and edgy. The true delusion of Dave Liszewski and Don Quixote is thinking that the chivalric journey is glamorous or enjoyable, as demonstrated by their obsession with the idealized female in their heads, namely Dulcinea and Katie Duxma, respectively. But the hero's journey is actually one of perpetual pain, and it only looks glamorous after the chivalric hero gets settled into his incredibly difficult lifestyle and makes it look easy. Getting the girl, achieving power over your fellows, and the epic adventure are mere afterthoughts of true heroism, but are never the point. They're just natural results of cultivating the inner strength necessary to achieve great deeds. But even these things are never guaranteed. Not even in the original chivalric stories like in Orlando Furioso, where he never gets with Angelica, and his love for her is a major character flaw that he has to move on from. It's distracting him from his chivalric duties. In that story, his heroic journey is about overcoming the temptation of a beautiful woman to save his kingdom and stop wanting to chase pussy. And Batman pretty much ends up forever alone too. You're only a true hero if you're willing to give up the schnicky for the cause, bros. But what's interesting about Mark Miller and his comics is that in the end, he doesn't deconstruct the superhero genre. Or if he does, he quickly reconstructs it as genuine superheroes emerge in the world he created, and Dave Liszewski himself becomes a real superhero eventually. It's no longer a LARP when you're willing to risk your own life for it, which is what Dave Liszewski does, so Mark Miller ends up recognizing this genuine admirable element of his character, even if said character initially starts on this journey for the wrong reasons. But I think it's interesting that both Mark Miller and Miguel Cervantes end up returning to the traditional tropes of the very genre they initially tried subverting, and I think it's only natural because it's my belief that it's impossible to truly deconstruct chivalric heroism. Even though countless authors have tried, some even were genuine masters of storytelling, but I believe they all failed. Even Mark Twain himself, who kind of had a hate boner for the Middle Ages for some reason I don't really understand. He praised Miguel Cervantes for ruining the silly chivalric romances with Don Quixote, and Mark Twain wrote a book called A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, mocking medieval ideas and tropes, and he apparently blamed Walter Scott's book of Ivanhoe for influencing young men of the South into fighting the Civil War through its simplistic values of a supposed failed society, by which he's referring to the Middle Ages. So it's incredibly surprising that the book that Mark Twain was most proud of writing was Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc, a romanticized retelling of Saint Joan of Arc's life. And it's this book that he enjoyed writing the most, which is interesting. The book is absolutely a veneration of Saint Joan of Arc as a heroic chivalric medieval figure. He believed this book was to be his magnum opus, but he starts the first few pages by coping and declaring Saint Joan to be a miraculous flower that stands out from the brutality of her filthy era, that she's not representative of the values of the Middle Ages. But Mark Twain, I hate to break it to you, bro, but she is. Saint Joan of Arc was absolutely a woman of her era, no matter how much Mark Twain would deny that. Which indicates that despite his modernist contempt for all things medieval, he was deep down still that young adolescent boy who had his imagination captivated by a wonderful historical heroine when he first learned of her existence while growing up. Her life story made Mark Twain abandon his usual satirical style, that sarcastic attitude common in his other books, and it's a fascinating turn of events for the humorous modernist author. Other attempts to subvert the chivalric hero story would be well-written books like Frank Herbert's Dune and Martin's Song of Ice and Fire, as well as badly written low-tier trash like The Boys show on Amazon. They all depict a cynical view of either medieval ideals or power dynamics in general, and they leaned heavily on the idea that power corrupts. Therefore, such a powerful hero, being a flawed man, would inevitably lead to disastrous consequences Their arguments are not wrong, but even they admit that in a corrupt world, people rising to the occasion is necessary, which is why they still portray genuine chivalric hero characters in their stories. Paul Atreides might be a King Arthur gone wrong, who caused the deaths of billions of people, and a cautionary tale on following heroes and messianic narratives, but Duncan Idaho, another character in the books, is a genuine, knightly, and noble character whose presence in the narrative naturally outshines Paul Atreides and becomes this cosmic super Chad and the epitome of humanity, and he even develops his own messianic hero narrative and destiny to save mankind. However, Frank Herbert is unique as a writer, politically at least if nothing else, while most subversive authors trying to deconstruct traditional heroic ideals tend to be left-leaning. But that's a discussion for another video. George R. R. Martin's situation is similar to Frank Herbert, where he attempts to subvert the chivalric romance through deeper meditation on power and corruption. But all that does is create natural narrative opportunities for heroic characters to step up, like Brienne of Tarth, who again is not a subversion of the heroic chivalric story just because she's a female knight. But it's Jon Snow who really fills the void by having several biblical traits, not only by having a resurrection event after being betrayed, which is guaranteed to happen in the books as well, but also by being born a bastard who was excluded because of his birth only to be chosen to lead others like the judge Jephthah from the Bible, who has the same story. Even though Jon Snow isn't really a bastard, but is the hidden royal and the true heir to the throne, which is even a more traditional trope. Of course, the books have not ended yet, so maybe Martin has the perfect subversion planned for us. But maybe he hasn't finished it yet because he doesn't. Many have speculated on this here on YouTube, because the traditional chivalric idea is that there is meaning to suffering, and George R. R. Martin can't subvert that very idea without subverting the meaning and purpose behind all his pain and sacrifice that he had while writing this absurdly difficult and large series. Which is why, of course, he's reluctant to do it. He either has to betray the spirit of his vision, or write a story that made nothing worthwhile, not even writing it. The idea that an overly corrupt, cynical world of false heroes just gives an opportunity for more traditional heroes to appear in the setting is particularly true about the Amazon show called The Boys. It pretends to be a subversion of the superhero genre, where the very concept of the superhero is expertly deconstructed, but it actually accomplishes just the opposite. Amazon itself literally commissioned a YouTube video essay explaining why the Starlight character is the real traditional superhero, which is hilarious because it undermines the entire message of the show about how superheroes are corporate illusions meant to pacify the masses. Not only that, but most superhero characters are so cartoonishly evil that they didn't subvert the genre's traditional depiction of heroes and villains at all. Watch me deconstruct The Boys right now. It's a world dominated by supervillains that pretend to be superheroes in order to maintain their control of society, but Starlight is one of the few true superheroes that joins forces with a team of fellow heroes and anti-heroes to take down the villains and bring them to justice. Boom, there you go, the subversion has been subverted! It's just another story about heroes and villains. It's not as nuanced about the nature of power and its effects on people as it pretends to be, least of all when you apply its ham-fisted political message, which is a common theme in these subversion stories. Because what The Boys as a show is actually saying is that real heroes vote Democrat, and that Donald Trump is a supervillain. That's literally the show's message, spelled out by Eric Kripke himself. Now don't worry, I won't get into the American election. My channel is more about broader discussions on political philosophy, and is a welcome to everyone of all political beliefs, even though I like poking fun at my socialist friends from time to time. I'm just mentioning American politics to make a point about The Boys as a show. My point is that not only does The Boys not deconstruct the black and white morality of the superhero genre, and its archetypes of heroes and villains, but it literally applies this logic to real-world politics, where you think more nuance would be appreciated. It's calling the American president-elect a supervillain who will send you to camps. That's literally what it's saying. They think all the weird, disgusting sex stuff will hide away its childishness, but to the contrary, it just makes it look even more like brain rot of some messed up suburban 14-year-old writing twisted erotic Superman fanfiction instead of studying for algebra. Now, when it comes to nuance, Alan Moore is the true master storyteller who came close to subverting the entire superhero genre, precisely because of his use of nuance when writing Watchmen. And if he stopped there, I think he maybe wouldn't have succeeded, because there are no real heroes in Watchmen, just misguided people following an erroneous sense of morality. They don't need a villain, they just need to be champions of different causes and ethical theories. And that's enough for them to clash with each other. The different heroes become the villains of their own stories. They're all just defending different ideas of what it means to do the good, of what it means to be good. And the overwhelming power of the Superman in the story doesn't make him evil, but just detached from human affairs. He simply can't relate to us. Alan Moore also questions the idea of heroism and morality itself by adhering to a deterministic view where all human action is predetermined and where there is no free will. Therefore, there is no courage, virtue, or honor because everything is predetermined. There is also no higher meaning or objective morality because we are predetermined to have our beliefs. Or maybe not, because Dr. Manhattan is predetermined to change his mind even though he already knows that will happen, which makes the whole thing a little dubious. And Rorschach is the ultimate misguided superhero who believes in objective morality and a cause worth fighting for, while committing atrocities and having a literal Rorschach test on his face that isn't ever changing and represents how the world he sees is nothing but a reflection of his subconscious and isn't anything objectively real. However, this is somewhat undermined by characters still acting like their choices matter, as well as this whole thing being a clear literary ruse by Alan Moore, because he clearly doesn't believe any of this. Because he clearly actually does believe in a cause worth fighting for. He just abstains from adding into his story a hero with a cause that he finds worthy. He omits such a heroic character that defends his values, only to give the story the illusion that there is no heroic cause, and that everything is just shades of gray. But again, Alan Moore himself clearly does not believe this. And we know this because Alan Moore actually did write a superhero that champions a moral vision that he defends, that he believes in. It was called V for Vendetta, the anarchist superhero with exactly his own political views that fights the only objectively evil force in Alan Moore's silly little mind: fascists. And it's hilarious because V for Vendetta is an elitist aristocrat who likes fencing, cites Shakespeare, and lives in a frickin' castle, clearly drawing from the chivalrous gentleman warrior archetype, not to mention the obvious parallels to Zorro and the Count of Monte Cristo, or the fact that he's wearing the face of a particular historical figure. I see you wearing a Guy Fawkes mask. I too want to blow up Parliament and install a Catholic theocracy! The character V is meant to be a likable left-wing freedom fighter and defender of the oppressed, and Rorschach is meant to be a misguided right-wing oppressive lunatic, vigilante psychopath. It's the same thing with the boys. Real heroes only exist if they share my exact political views, which I would respect if they were at least honest about the sentiment and not pretending to be all intellectual and sophisticated about it. But what I find hilarious is that V for Vendetta is dripping with noble aristocratic and chivalric imagery, while Rorschach is basically just a murder hobo. As if Alan Moore is saying, "Look at this guy. He's poor and smelly. He's alone with no girlfriend. Isn't that pathetic? Isn't he pathetic? Aren't you pathetic for liking him? Look at this strapping anarchist in his cape and perfect hair who likes to torture adolescent girls in his basement. Isn't he just dashing and wonderful?" I feel like Alan Moore has very little self-awareness. And by analyzing V in his aesthetic, it's clear that deep down Alan Moore has Batman fantasies like the rest of us, only his Batman is politically retarded. No wonder this guy doesn't understand why Rorschach is more beloved by readers than his own hypocritical power fantasies. Don't get me wrong, Rorschach is messed up, but his humble, single-minded dedication to the ideals of protecting the weak, where he never compromises in doing what he believes to be right, and that is completely devoid of any pretentious pseudo-intellectual garbage, makes Rorschach a breath of fresh air in that hopeless setting in Watchmen. The fact that Alan Moore can't understand this was always funny to me. He thinks his readers are all fascist superhero fans, instead of realizing that he himself is in fact just another intellectual prissy sophist making stuff up, who doesn't bleed for anything, build anything, or believe in anything other than tearing down greater ideals. I can agree with Alan Moore that fascism is evil, but even something as terrible as fascism can be hated for the wrong reasons. I mean, it's forcing us to choose between fascism and fricking anarchy. Those are my options! Are you kidding me? Alan Moore, as an anarchist, believes in a world where you can do as you please, and that having any leaders that impose any restrictions is inherently bad, which is why superheroes are all fascist to him, because they impose a moral hierarchy. To Alan Moore, the only objectively moral thing to do is to fight against the idea and belief of objective morality itself, which is stupid. Though to his credit, Alan Moore still adds nuance in his anarchist power fantasy by making the fascists somewhat sympathetic human characters with their own flaws, and motivations, and making his ideological proxy protagonist still a flawed human being with questionable methods. Though the torturing and brainwashing of a teen girl in his underground castle is disturbingly glossed over, and said girl forgives him and becomes his loyal follower and protege. Even the movie adaptation knew that was messed up and chose to at least give her some self-respect and make her leave his ass. But the nuance added by Alan Moore makes the narrative feel like an actual story, which is more than what the woke activism masquerading as comics that came after him managed to accomplish. Conclusion. Despite intellectuals throughout the centuries writing the chivalric romance off as childish silliness with little practical use, in reality it's one of the most useful story genres for a civilization. Way more than a lot of the self-indulgent ivory tower stuff that only academics like to read. Because unlike whining about the injustices of the world, the chivalric romance actually inspires people to do something about it. But it also inspires and drives young men to risk their lives in real horrific and brutal war in the hopes of living up to and achieving those transcendent ideas in their own lives. Like Saint Ignatius de Loyola, who got wounded in battle trying to be a knight precisely because he loved reading those stories of chivalry. To Chris Kyle, the famous American sniper, who was a big fan of Punisher comics and used the Marvel Heroes logo while he operated in combat in the Iraq War. There's a reason why Captain America comics were created and then shipped to the young soldiers on the Western Front in World War II. Which is, I guess, the real reason why many despise the legacy of the chivalric romance like Mark Twain, because it can motivate young men in fighting for terrible causes and really questionable wars. But it can also inspire them to fight for noble causes in necessary wars, too, like how Lord of the Rings was of great comfort to the Ukrainians in their fight for freedom against the Empire that killed 11 million of them in the Holodomor War, the last time they were occupied. Tolkien's idea of the free folk fighting the tyrannical invading empire might be highly mythologized, but is often true in history. Cynicism can be just as delusional as idealism when you insist on refusing to see the objective nobility of defending your homeland, which reveals the true usefulness of the chivalric medieval romance, which is to help you find meaning in your very real suffering, which is why it's no coincidence that it was veterans of one of the most brutal wars in human history who revived the chivalric ideals in the modern 20th century, namely C.S. Lewis, Ernst Jünger, and Tolkien himself, all of whom fought in World War I. These three gentlemen revived these ideals in their writings precisely as a way to cope with what they had lived through, which makes sense because the chivalric romance were very popular in the late Middle Ages and early modern period, precisely because people were living through things that required this mindset to survive. Those stories were highly fantastical with wizards and magic, but the themes they explored were very real. And the ideal of the chivalric great hero facing overwhelming odds is also very real. Men like Musashi, Ernst Jünger, Teddy Roosevelt, Godfrey of Bouillon, many others, all of whom are examples of people who pretty much lived the real life of epic journeys, many of which had actual chivalric tropes in them, if you look at their biographies. Their real-life stories are often more inspiring and strange than anything a writer could make up. They're flawed humans, to be sure, but that's the nature of being human. The heroic narratives that we told ourselves over the centuries never omitted this. Many of our real historical figures committed atrocities and acts of madness, but so did characters like Orlando, the Punisher, Anakin Skywalker, etc. The act of storytelling does explore the darkness of the warrior archetype in history, just as much as it explores his nobility. For all the questionable things George Washington did, he founded a great country. For all the things Cortez did, he helped his country gain wealth to fight off invasion from the Ottomans. But more than their flaws and terrible atrocities born from human weakness that the men who seek the chivalric life might commit, what causes the most controversy are the causes that many of these men, motivated by these ideals of chivalry, might champion. But that doesn't take away from the value of chivalry itself. In the American Civil War, for instance, both sides were informed by chivalrous ideals. But of course it was men like Ulysses S. Grant, and those like him, who truly lived up to the idea of heroism and protecting the weak. I think it's impossible to truly subvert the chivalric romance despite the messiness of history and human nature, because deep down, we all know that some causes are worth fighting for, despite the risk of great suffering, and we intensely admire the men and women who take that risk. We can't subvert the chivalric romance that informs space opera classics like Star Wars, or the token fantasy tropes that George R.R. Martin tries to undo, or the superhero genre that many other authors have tried to undo as a whole, because we cannot subvert the concept of imposing morality without causing a paradox. If you say it's wrong to impose your idea of right and wrong on others, you create a paradox. It's how we get the anarchist superhero who imposes by violent force his vision of freedom and becomes a leader of a political movement mobilizing people against leaders. The whole thing is just regarded beyond belief. Because that's what the chivalric hero is. Someone who seeks out the objective good, tries to defend the good, or tries to impose the good. The issue is when we disagree on what is good. And this is when champions of a misguided sense of good might end up being the worst villains of all in their zeal to defend what is actually evil. But it's precisely the existence of these false heroes that make real heroes who rise up to face them so important and inevitable in our thinking and culture. It's why we glorify them in our writings, and why these are consistently among the most celebrated stories in every civilization, culture, or political movement that ever existed. Everyone loves a hero, even if we disagree on who the heroes are, and we admire them because of their personal sacrifices to the cause. Therefore, we must remember true chivalry is about making suffering and sacrifice a way of life for the good of others. If you get into it hoping for an idealized reward, then you might end up going, "Hey, where's my anime waifu harem? Why is no one offering me a kingdom for me to rule? Where are all my gosh darn superpowers?" Just because you volunteered in the local soup kitchen. Stories are about seeing meaning in our lives, but especially the meaning in our pain, which I explore through narrative storytelling itself in my webcomic called Fractal Fables on Webtoons, which I really hope you guys check out. Again, it's totally free. All you guys have to do is click the link in the description and start reading the episodes as they come out. Nothing more. The artist Gabi and I, we made a whole first season already, but we'll only make a second season if you guys help to make it a success. So nudging the Webtoon algorithm by giving the first episodes a read and a like and a comment over there will help a lot. Just give the first 5 episodes a shot and then decide if it's interesting enough to keep reading. If you like my YouTube content, helping me there as well is much appreciated. Then you can also decide whether it's worth supporting Gabi and I on Patreon, where we'll be giving you bonus content related to the web comic. It's my patrons who really make all of this possible. I could not thank you all enough. And thank you all for listening to my ramblings. Have a good day, my friends.